Welcome to Systemic Societal Health, the podcast that explores how the science of energy networks creates a logical, practical, rigorous, and heartwarming understanding of what goes into building healthy, durably vibrant human networks. I'm your host, Dr. Sally Gerner, Research Director for Edinburgh University's Planetary Health Lab. Today we'll be talking with Mike Field about his work using systems thinking to develop practical approaches to creating lasting systemic socio-economic change. Our specific focus will be on differentiating between healthy hierarchies and oligarchic ones. Mr. Field has over 25 years' experience designing, assessing, training, and implementing systems-based approaches to market, educational, health, and environmental challenges. Through his work, Mike has played a key role in setting learning and research agendas in the field of systems approaches to international development. He is currently a market systems analyst at EcoVentures International, where he provides guidance on applying systems lenses to address challenging social and market contexts internationally. Welcome to the podcast, Mike. You had some questions about hierarchies versus oligarchies, and how do you explain the difference and things like that, or what were your questions?
So that's part of it. Part of it is so what we've come to the conclusion is that most societies still are kind of function in that way, where there's a hierarchy, and that hierarchy somewhat based on its own group perceptions.
Right.
Feel there's a greater good of being extractive. You know what I mean? They use their hierarchy and the power in the hierarchy to essentially make sure that their group gets first dibs on resources.
Right.
To the exclusion of a whole bunch of others. But that seems more of a standard way of working. That's the more common way we see it in terms of just populations under a regime. So the question we always come back to is if you kind of take the idea that systems are self-organizing, they're designed to work that way, right? Then that must be the way that at least a good portion of humans operate, with some benefit of doing that, although you can make the argument what that is. So if that is I guess an evolutionary accepted way for them to operate, what would be then the way to make it attractive for humans to start operating in a different way? Like, it's just that assumption that we're not coming from a position of this is broken. We're coming from a position of it needs a new normal, although what they're doing is normal. You know what I mean?
Well, absolutely. I mean, so I completely agree with you that it's there for a reason. I mean, it does certain things, and it does them really well, and we need those certain things, and that includes really efficient distribution. So I was listening to a report on China and how they're able to do things because of their, it's hierarchical, intensely hierarchical, and obediently focused kind of thing. They're able to do things much faster and more thoroughly, like take care of the pandemic or build high-speed rail systems, or
genocide, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes.
Unfortunately,
well, that's the paradox. I mean, so but there's a reason that they exist, because they're really good at certain things.
Yes, yeah. They're organized to absorb and diffuse as they need to. Also,
and so the short version of what I would, the evolutionary view of that would be that they're now, because they are so powerful. I mean, and we can now destroy ourselves completely. So they're essentially, that kind of excessive concentration is going to be outdated at some point, and we're sort of working our way through how do you create a hierarchy that has the benefits of rapid mobilization of large quantities of resources, which isn't oligarchic in the sense that it's essentially self-serving for the people who are running it, who then form a little clique and a cronyism and that kind of stuff. And part of the reason I'm interested in your work is that I think some of it has to do with distributed empowerment. So that, because you can't have, I mean, it's like, who's going to watch the watchers? Well, you can't have a bigger guy who's got a bigger gun to watch, the guys on top. What you have to have is some kind of feedback mechanism from the regular, the rest of the society, so that's relatively effective. And what we found out in America is that one man, one vote isn't it, so that's, so there's, go ahead.
No, I was just going to agree with you on that. You can see in America, when I was looking at actually started doing this and I think we even talked about this during the financial crisis, of seeing how those mechanisms over time have that were somewhat effective at counterbalancing the power concentrations have worn and ebbed.
Exactly.
And become so weak, they're not effective anymore. And that has resulted in all kinds of counter mechanisms that were in place to kind of be useful. Like if you take derivatives, it's a good example, I think, for me. They are a quite useful tool, but for various reasons, the people in charge of them decided that it was much more useful for them to just steal money rather than keep the usefulness of the derivatives. So they started manipulating them and taking advantage of the context of them, and then creating lots of potential risk in how they were doing them, because they weren't really then fulfilling any kind of function, any kind of risk sharing, risk mitigating function that they can do.
Right. And then you got to look at the people who rise in that system, because in our system, we promote the idea that, selfish genes run the world, or the best way evolution runs. Self-interest and rational agents who don't have any values is the best way to run an economy. We have this extremist kind of thing that rationalizes this behavior. So,
and it amplifies it to a point of bad behavior.
Exactly, right. So the people who rise most in that system are the ones who take that to heart and do it really, really well.
Yeah, and then cause damage.
Right, exactly. So, so the theory has it that we go through these cycles where, hierarchy is necessary, and but then it becomes oligarchic, which is its aim is to serve the wealth and power of some small number of people, and and it becomes rigged to do that, and so it essentially hijacks the reforms of the previous round, because it becomes unchecked, it just accelerates that to a place where you get a crisis, which is what we're sort of now facing. Both, we're facing it not only environmentally but economically. We have these gigantic bubbles running all over the place, and
there's no social mobility, and the concentration is getting increasingly more with a very small group. All the factors that would indicate U.S. is becoming less inclusive and more Russia.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, one of the reasons, again, I'm interested in your work is because you have these relatively practical approaches to getting self-sustaining cultural changes going, which I think is critical.
Yeah.
Because you want eventually to have this big, multiple group or multiple level appreciation for the need for common cause values, so that it's not just one person, and doing what's best for you is going to somehow turn out magically all right for everybody. And for me, some of them are things like, you assume that the guy who owns, or the shareholders who own things, have somehow a divine right to take as much of the profits and the benefits from somebody else's labor as they can and as they want. And original capitalism had this idea that you would invest back into your organization, but gone with the wind. It's much easier to the stock prices.
Yeah, you can almost see it similar to the kind of evolved incentives. Just exactly as you keep on describing, there's almost always this consistent set of evolved incentives
right
to concentrate the bad behavior, or the willingness to kind of leverage their position of power for their own good or their own interest. So you can see that with the stock, with the way also you saw this shift over the numbers of years between management, compensation from management around stock price, that is near term, quarterly,
right,
that then drove incentives for people to manipulate stock price, all for their short-term management.
Right, exactly.
Which then the kind of spiraled out of control. So the underlying value proposition, because we look at this quite a bit actually in terms of how an economy's, what's the value of equity over, say, and the focus of building value or wealth through equity. firm value is because in the early stages, that's quite a useful shift because it ratchets up incentives towards better behavior, towards a market working better for delivering value. Because if you want to have value in a company, it's very hard for that company to grow over time in terms of the value of the company itself if you're lying, cheating, and stealing, unless you're using oligarchy powers, right?
Right, exactly, right.
Right. So assuming there's some rule of law, then the having firm value be the key kind of driver of what the firm's objective is to do, is to build value in the firm. That is kind of a useful set of incentives. But so it worked for a while in the U.S. to some extent. But just like everything else, just aligning with what you're saying, the set of incentives started turning in on themselves, so that that became a short-term reference, not to delivering value back to society, but extracting value from society.
Right. They had all of these assumptions, which were then, of course, validated by the metrics that they chose. So GDP doesn't measure how the money is being used or where it's going. It doesn't matter whether you're making it from inflating a stock price or building a road or a school.
Yeah, exactly. Just like profit in itself doesn't determine whether there's a value addition back to society in the transactions you're giving.
Right.
And stock markets stock value used to be somewhat a better metric of that there's value in it, because there was an assumption, like you said, that held for a bit. I'm not sure even if it really held at the time, but that the firm isn't cheating people that much, because if they were cheating people, they couldn't sell more, right? But eventually, I think what's happened is the manipulation of stock and stock prices it has so detached from really the firm's ability to deliver value back to society, its customers, that it's not a useful metric anymore.
Exactly, right. But the institution has institutionalized those measures.
Yes, so that yes, absolutely. So now they've amplified and, like you said, institutionalized it, so nobody recognizes that what they've done is locked into a set of incentives that is going to encourage firms to be increasingly more extractive.
Exactly, right.
Mhm.
So, see, okay, my basic premise in the flow net or the energy system stuff is that every pattern of organization reaches its limits, and basically what we're doing now is reaching the limits of oligarchic capitalism. And when that happens, its shortfalls, its dysfunctions, the things it just doesn't do well, creates this buildup of frustrated human energy that's it's actually driving people in all different fields to come up with better ways. I mean, heck, I've given talks my favorite one was advertising agencies. So I gave a talk, and man, this was like 10, 15 years ago, a long time ago. And what they were discovering in advertising agencies is that they were exhausting let's make it glitzier and sexier and whatever, because people were just so disgusted that they would tune out. And, so that you got to the place where magazines had, 60% of the pages were really some kind of advertising, and people would stop buying magazines because they didn't want to just look at the thing. So what the advertisers did was they realized that what they needed to do was change people's sense of what the brand was really about, and that it wasn't just about ripping you off and lying and deceiving and manipulating and things like that. So they started what did they call it? Strategic planning, I believe they called it. But they actually had this noble purpose worksheet, which they gave out to some of their clients. So like, when you got into this business, you got into shoes. You realized that the reason you did it was because you wanted to do blah, 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 blah. And how do you get back to that? And how do you convince your clients that this is really what you're about, and so that you are trustworthy? So they've been struggling with that kind of thing. But it's an example of how these ideas about maximizing profit for a few people end up, especially when they're done in a socially destructive way, manipulative and deceitful and destructive kind of way, those things eventually are kind of building up and creating education is same kind of thing. There are people who they know how to do education, created the kind of education that they want, that would create the kind of people that would be creative, committed, problem-solving, critical thinking citizens, happier, with more meaning making and this kind of stuff. They know how to do that, but it just never takes root because of the habits and because of the oligarchic institutions that are
Mm-hmm.
all oriented towards maintaining the status quo of the power system. So anyway, but so there's a lot of those people around. In fact, one of the reasons I want to have this podcast is to try to bring those kinds of people together so that they realize that they're all part of a bigger transformation.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, one of the things I think we're trying to do in this sense is have some sense of the modeling out of what the pathway would look like towards that at multiple levels.
Uh-huh.
We start basically straightforward and simple. Like, a firm shouldn't steal and cheat. So let's look for the firms who don't want to steal and cheat, who would actually like to deliver value. And then we go through this it was interesting the way you talked about the marketing, because we go through that with the firms and say, okay, well, you have to recognize that if you want to keep this customer and then you want them to buy again from you and you want that customer to tell another customer that they like you have to create that image in their head that you're a fair, good person and that your firm is doing something useful for them. And that's how we get around to that idea that branding isn't necessary. Branding isn't the logo, but branding is the image somebody has in your head of whether you're trustworthy.
Right.
Right. And we use that as the business entry point to start talking to that firm about why it's important to engage the customer, talk to the customer, make sure the customer's happy, figure out how to give satisfaction to the customer about whatever the customer wants, and then use that as a building block for building their business, their actual business over time. And then we would go, and once that firms start to do that, then we try to amplify that as a competitive, advantageous way of acting like a business, whether through media or through just raising the profile of that firm, or by amplifying the voice of the customer that's happy through media and other things. So we're trying to create that virtuous feedback that then changes the competitive landscape, right?
Right, which is wonderful. I mean, I think there are people out there who are desperately looking for that kind of thing. Yeah.
But when we're doing it, we're also then saying, well, look, this is not this as this early stage happens. It's not nearly sufficient. We have to figure out how to build a consumer safety civil society that actually does it, a media that actually has a business model that works, that then advocates effectively for its listeners, has actually pays for and sees proper journalism as a real valued add addition to its network of services it's giving. So we have to then start building all these things up in stages as we can, which is hard, as you can imagine. But we are trying to model it out in the full set of where would we get the counterbalancing and reinforcing structures in place so that there would always be pushback against oligarchies structures.
Yeah, and so doesn't it end up coming down to a common culture that values?
Yeah, that's the biases we're talking about. Then we actually started using like moral foundation theory.
Don't know that.
So it essentially just says that there's like between 4 and 6 basic moral moralities, if you want to call it that, like loyalty, authority, caring, fairness, and sometimes they use like relative value or market price value. They use there's a I guess competing views. The way I take from it is that human beings, there are some foundational kind of areas of that people need to have a moral focus on to cooperate. Like, it's not good to go just shooting people, right? You have to have some caring for people.
Right.
You have to, there's some moral infrastructure, norms around loyalty and hierarchy, because those are all, they do important things for people, humans. Right. So we build a moral kind of case mythology around those things as a way to kind of keep people to believe in them, I guess, if you want to talk about it. So what the moral foundation kind of is saying now, the way I'm interpreting it, is that the kind of moral foundations for a large group society are going to be different than from an oligarchy society. and those are going to be an overweighting or a stronger moral value placed on, say, fairness and relative value, and a lower moral value placed on, say, hierarchy and based on community or group loyalty. They would still be there because they're always going to be there, but they're lowered in value somehow. So the shame is it's more prevalent and sharper when you're acting in a way that is, and not in an equitable way. You know what I mean? So you would think like Black Lives Matter, those types of things are quite important social movements to amp up, as long as they reinforce the idea that equity as a moral foundation is more important almost than communal loyalty.
Right. Okay. So that Black Lives Matter is actually an excellent one, because it has the problem that some of the people on the Black Lives side of things are actually doing the unfairness on the black side, so that they're, it's, let's see, so that there's like reparations is probably a good one for me.
Yeah.
So while it's fair for the blacks to get equity, to have better access to, say, seed capital and education and healthcare and all those kinds of things, and wages and equitable wages and so on and so forth. But is it fair to ask all white people to pay for all black people, or even a large segment of black people, to be paid for wrongs done to them, but maybe or maybe not by any of your own relatives, so you may not be really responsible?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I have a little bit different view from it. I don't think it's substantially different, but what we've seen overseas is that a process, whether or not reparations is good or not is less the issue we've taken on. It's more the process of coming to an agreement of how to agree that was bad, and that we can have a process over it. Whether that includes an agreement, okay, you should get some kind of benefit because you were treated badly in the past, or you don't get a benefit, but we see there's a real value of improved investment or increased investment that focuses in on you, and
exactly
to get you to the point that so you can add value faster to society. But it's that process of a shared stakeholder process that agrees to the path forward, and then everybody seems comfortable, even if it's not perfect.
Exactly. I completely agree. I mean, and yeah, because there is an inequity, and it should be somehow acknowledged or resolved in some way. It's just that a knee jerk having them pay so much money is part of it. Is the language too. I mean, I think languaging is a huge deal in all of this.
Yeah, the one thing that's really fascinating, because I've worked quite a bit in some post-conflict environments, is that as hard as it is, the moving past the victimization to the victims agreeing that things are okay is almost a central starting point. So the problem a little bit with the Black Lives Matter, I think, is kind of as you were saying, but what we're learning is that if they get stuck with "you owe me this because I was treated badly," that is not a starting point that creates a solid foundation. It creates an us versus them.
Right, exactly.
And it moves away from the equity fairness place you need to get, because you're always going to see that you owe me something, which tends to be a really troubling. Actually, it's a really troubling foundation on which you often get back into conflict.
Right. So when you were saying that getting past the victimhood is kind of a starting place, so how do you do? What would that look like, or how do you do that?
Where I've seen it work fairly well, and I've not been directly involved in it, but I've come afterwards and seen where it's actually made sense, is where they held these kind of reconciliation meetings, essentially in Rwanda and in Liberia, where they get the people who did horrible things to each other, and they bring them in, and they figure out a social process for coming to grips and then forgiving. It's not always so easy, but it has worked in certain communities, and when it does work, then it moves quickly towards it works towards the idea of amplifying the equity, fairness,
right,
morality coming to play and being amplified, and maybe decreasing the us versus them, the kind of loyalty of different groups. to getting towards the question of a uniform fairness of what's fair for everybody.
Right.
That's worked pretty well. Although, I don't. The challenge with that, to some extent, is it's highly intensive and it's a facilitated processes where it's worked. And there's really good people with it, and there's lots of versions of it now. Like we were working with one group, and they call it stretch collaboration is the term they used. The Rios partners. Have you heard of those?
No.
Adam Kahane, I think is his name, is one of the guys who does it. Anyways, their view, their method is just that people who are in conflict should be able to work through a process, so they don't necessarily have to like each other, but recognize the need to work together.
Huh. So out of curiosity, so in terms of getting past oligarchy, one of the things that strikes me is that there is a certain way of looking at it that is, if a benefit, it's going to be a benefit to at least some of the oligarchy is going to figure out that it's going to be to their benefit to stop raping and pillaging as much as they do.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. We see it all the time. It's usually a second generation out.
Ah, that's true.
Yeah, but it definitely is. It's something we actually now actively look for. When I was in Bangladesh, we were looking for the oligarchy families that have now diffused because they have a second generation, so there's a lot more of them. And some of them wanting to change the nature because they're not really the anointed version of the family. So it was easier then to convince them they have resources, they have skill sets, and that they could be the start of a set of counterbalancing forces against the oligarchy institutions.
So you don't think there's any, I mean, maybe I'm being romantic about this, but I grew up with a lot of, small business entrepreneur kinds of people. Everybody started a business.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, there's now documented evidence that if you have a more of a collaborative learning culture inside your organization, where there was a book. Let's see, what is it? There were three things. You have to put your people above your material things. You have to put the messiness of learning above orderliness of procedures, and you have to put the shepherding of resources for the continuation of the whole above everything else. So, and those created organizations that were adaptive, so that they would, these were called living organizations, because they would, they changed their basic, their basic, business model all the time, depending upon the context, and while still, again, we're having this incredible loyalty and collaborative creativity inside their organization, which allowed them to do all of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, so I take it most of the, the gigantic ones nowadays, they're not going to buy into that.
Well, yeah, anybody who's in the middle, who's at the top of the oligarchies, aren't going to be the ones that want to change, most likely. But there's probably certain elements within the oligarchy structure that we see do want to change. But I think the point you were also making is that that's necessary but not sufficient. So we would also want to look for the people who are completely outside the oligarchy structure, and how to get them to be able to allocate or organize resources in a way so they can also compete, participate, push back on the system.
You mean smaller level organizations?
Yes.
Medium and small, yeah.
Yeah, they come from the outside, but figure out where the cracks in the system allow them to kind of emerge and grow and deliver real value somehow, but then help them figure out how to kind of come to a point where they have the network and the structures to compete or start to push back on the oligarchy structure. Which is
sort of interesting, because one of the people we have, Curtis Ogden, he specializes in building these multi-level stakeholder-owned organizations. He just particularly does it around food networks.
Yeah.
So that they, you still have the, well, I guess there's examples of it. What is it? Trying to remember. It's a dairy group. Anyway, it started in the organic dairy, I think it was. Anyway, they started as a small group, I think in Canada, and they were dairy farmers, and they banded together to do a few things that required more people to do it. So kind of pool resources and get a little bit of economies of scale kind of thing. But then they also, wanted to create this brand so that they were recognized um, as being quality and also committed to adding value again. And then they just keep expanding, and whenever they bring new people in, they're still part of the basic agreements about what you do and what you don't do, and people give you, maybe help you with seed capital getting started so that you'll become part of this whole organization, but committed to it. And then they can hire lobbyists and they can hire accountants, and so they offload, and again they get the benefits of common cause and economies of scale at the same time.
Yeah, interesting. We worked with those types of models. They're called different things in different business terms, but that's actually one of the models we've tried to figure out how to get to work. It's a hard model to make work. It seems more kismet than easy to fix, easy to make work. But yeah, we're familiar with it for lots of reasons. It can be quite a disruptive model when there's a real value of some level of scale, but you really don't. But you'd rather keep the small businesses active and a little bit of diversity in structures in the
right. Absolutely right.
So I mean, it's actually quite hard. Worked on it multiple times. It's not so easy, but it is quite an interesting model.
So do you have any other ideas about how you get these? I mean, because it's not easy, but it's more doable to get these kinds of common cause values and reciprocity and fairness and things like that going at the small groups, where you get more rapid feedback with the local local consumers and cities and things like that. But when you get bigger, it just gets harder and harder. So do you have any other models for how you go about doing these multi-level kinds of?
Sure. So we've tried it in different ways in different contexts. The hardest one is where you're looking at less hierarchy. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, more distributed. Yeah, right.
Yeah, more distributed. That's a lot harder. So we look for them, but we find that often where donors have tried to do that, they try to only do that as a way to shift power from one group to another, say to a farm group from a trader group, right? But then the farm group acts just like the trader group after they have the power. You know what I mean? You're not really dealing with the underlying problem. So they do this with cooperatives all the time. They'll go in and force a cooperative to form with the idea that the main problem is that markets are always adversarial. So we just want the poor people to have power, so they can take it from the trader. Give it to the trader. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't really get at the underlying problem, is that the markets really shouldn't be so adversarial. There should be a stronger alliance building and cooperation around solving problems through products or efficient move of production of food that makes sense for the society, right? And doing that, then they generate value and they generate wealth. So that has not worked when they've tried to do it that way. But what we've tried to do is look at either how do you build alliance? We'd use a little bit different terms, but we've used this idea of voluntary networks, where we would look at a firm that is like a middle-sized firm that would like to become a little larger. And we say, look, you have a distribution network where you're selling agricultural inputs to a bunch of small firms, like really micro firms. And those micro firms then sell it on to like small farmers in some area. Why don't we work with you to create an effective strategy to build almost a single network where you guys agree on an alliance and a way of operating, and even a single brand as a network of 100 stores, and then you can buy as a single brand, even though all of your independent companies, and you agree on a kind of a joint inventory management strategy.
Yeah, that's what I think Curtis is trying to do more of. That's more of what he's trying to do. So we still have the diversity and the independence. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. And we do that because the easier part, it's easier or that ends up being easier because it's a firm. We're working with a firm and we're talking about the strategy of how they build a kind of a volunteer network where they end up becoming a key node in the network. So they have a lot of influencing roles on it, and it's quite powerful for them if they can do it well. And that works on the supply side, meaning buying from poorer communities, or in this case, buying from dairies, which we've worked on. How would that work? Even to the point of where we were working with firms that they would create a way for those small farmers to buy into a company through market share by delivering shares for performance. You know what I mean? So a way to kind of create binding in those things. It's interesting because you really do have a whole set of mindset and relational challenges in the beginning that you have to work through. And in the US, it's generally easier because there is at least some foundation of moral equity. That there is an underlying perception in the US of equity, fairness, that is stronger than in other countries. There's a lot more the morality around loyalty and greater good relative to my group winning over your group is a higher hurdle to make these volunteer structures work, or these kind of, like you said, multi-layer organizational structures work.
So one of the other groups that I work with is educational reform people, and I just got an email from one of them, and she was saying how most of the things that they know that they need to do in order to get these, again, collaborative, creative, critically thinking citizens, empowered citizens, basically, they've been known for a long time. They just don't take root.
Mm-hmm.
So, and to my mind, education is a huge lever in terms of getting things to move in the right direction.
Huge, right?
And so, any thoughts about how you would get people or institutions or communities willing to take on these kinds of proper educational techniques in order to create the kind of
I can talk about what we tried. I don't know if we were successful. We were doing this actually in Liberia. One of the things we came up to was the hierarchy and people's perception of hierarchy about education. It became a stumbling block, meaning the parents, at least in Liberia, weren't empowered enough to create a proper feedback mechanism about what education means. And that system there was super corrupt. So what we spend our time trying to do is empowering communities through PTA-like organizations, and then amping up child performance, the performance in education, as just raising the prestige around, especially girls doing well in school, through community kind of social capital events like prestige events, honor rolls and stuff like that. And then using the school to create to be more of a center of the community learning. So all the efforts were trying to empower the community around having a stake in school, and then having an influence in school, and then seeing that education was the kind of a thing they needed to engage, not disengage from. Like I don't send my kids there so I don't have to watch them, was a kind of an underlying problem. And we were trying to recreate the school as a center of a communal kind of shared values place.
So have you ever thought about trying this in the US, where you have parents who are more empowered, but still, well, of course, I guess a lot of that is taxes and who's paying for whose education and how much.
Yeah, and empowered in where I'm living right now in a wealthy neighborhood is different than empowered in a poor neighborhood.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yes, actually, I have been interested in this because there's a part of what we're looking at related to education, but it's also how the breakdown of some of the family structures in poor communities, and some of the kind of systemic institutions. Sometimes it's race related, but mostly, you can even take race out of it. It's probably a systemic bias against poor people, if you go with that, right?
Right.
That then creates some mechanism, I think, break down family without providing without effective ways to build the community up.
Right.
Right. And because of that, then they don't really engage in any kind of advocacy or value around education that I think would have to happen. because that's also where then gangs come in.
So you have to have some way to empower the adults economically before you can really get at the educational thing.
And create the kind of connection of community. I think this is where the churches have been, problematic in some cases, but they are an effective tool in some of the Black communities I've looked at before, at least in the U.S., where they are a really important kind of communal mechanism. They keep some of the communal infrastructure in place when it's being torn apart, because they also then run into the countering the non-religious view of ends up being gangs end up filling that void in a lot of cases. We're looking at this case in Honduras actually for a potential project we want to help with, and you can see where the through migration, internal migration within Honduras, and an aggressive oligarchy structure in that country, which essentially is to steal boatloads of stuff from everybody for them own them, and they're an oligarchy across, like you would expect, across economics and political and social. So, the five families control the politics and the economy, or something like that. Then what happens is the moving around of people starts to break down the family and communal dynamics that allow people to manage risk and get what they need from feeling safe or secure. So gangs fill that void, and when that type of structure comes in, it's really hard to unwind it, I think. So how do you unwind it? Church is a counterbalance to it, but church usually also has its own problems. Right. So how do you start building back community? The one thing we were trying to do is how do you do that through the school? So you really create a school becomes more center of a communal network, delivering economic opportunities, education opportunities, kind of support opportunities for the adults. Then it also becomes a place where kids also go.
Wow.
So we were doing things, testing things like taking the older family members that are in the community and having them come to a school so that they can do the child care services through the school, so that it could let young mothers who have kids stay in school, can help parents so they don't have to pull their daughters out, which is the case that we were saying problem, out of school so they could do labor for some reason, right? Which you also see in urban spaces in the US, that the kids get out of school pretty quickly because they need money because parents aren't making money.
Right.
And because they often have young kids who aren't in school, somebody needs to take care of them. The kids don't make money, so they're a drain, so pull them out of school to take care of the kids.
Yeah.
Right? So you create a child care structure in the school that also then you could tie into how do you treat kids? How do you be a proper parent as part of the training, because you have a nursery in the school, right?
Right.
Like all those things we're trying to do. So you start creating the school as a valued hub in a community.
That's actually one of the things that this Susan Cavallo group that did. I mean, for one of the things they did was they have these little virtual communities so that kids learn how to do economic presentations and how to they have a little legal system and a little monetary system, so they begin to learn all of the the ins and outs of how this really works in real life. In a relatively supportive way, so that when they come out, they're actually, they're functioning adults in much more than many of the kids that come out of the regular standard schools where they're just teaching you stuff. But so, out of curiosity, so there's some set of you guys that are in international development that have been working on these kinds of things together.
Yeah, well, on and off. Yeah, but there's a core network of people that are more involved in this thinking, for sure.
And what do you call yourselves?
We don't call ourselves anything. I guess we call ourselves systems thinkers. We haven't come with a better term, but that the systems, the application of complexity and systems thinking on complex social problems is kind of what the core group of people have started. They started along that path. And there's been a group of us, I guess, that then it's splintered in some cases, but I know most of them.
So how do you apply for grants? I mean, is there a particular language that you use? I mean, are you beginning to use complexity theory for one thing? I know.
Yes. So it depends, as you'd imagine. It depends on where the funding source is coming from. So, USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, which is a large funding source for international development, is we have been advocating with them to change their way of thinking, and they have taken on some or a lot of the language around systems thinking and complexity. I think it's still weak because in the end, USAID is still just a political organization, and its political interests always outweigh the kind of development interests.
Yeah,
as you would expect. So there's that. There are a group of us who've been asking the questions of what are some alternative sources of funds, like either foundations or others that would allow us to give more freedom to test the thinking a little bit more. This is all new. We're kind of cutting edge in some cases. Like we're looking at into a dark room, thinking how could we learn what to do? Because it is a lot that what we are learning is the cooperative nature of humans is quite central. But how do you get them to cooperate in a way that works better for them, as opposed to a way that worked before? Right. This is, I guess, your oligarchy structures in hunter-gatherer systems versus a much larger society that provides for some of the foundations of a floor, so that people don't fall into so there's always protections.
Right, exactly.
In some formal structure so that the society can get bigger, but by getting bigger, you can harness more human resources to solve more human problems.
Right, and you also you're able to support greater diversity so that you can also have more niches and increase the richness and the adaptability of your system and all this kind of stuff.
And become more resilient because you have a larger scale of diversity that's not susceptible to the same kind of risks.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes, we're looking at trying to understand that more and trying to figure out where we could find funding to be more creative at testing things.
Yeah, so are we. So I'm doing this now out of Edinburgh's Planetary Health Lab, but I don't know what language to use because I'm not really a complexity person, because they're mostly doing simulations and computer, analysis of patterns in large amounts of data. And I'm more based on the empirical study of how energy dynamics, create organization and, how that plays into growth and development, and then eventually into human systems and in terms of intelligence, because energy is also kind of like energy trails start out as a physical basis of information, so that you have this interesting ability to connect the human and the physical sciences in a way that it doesn't destroy one or the other. I mean, so both sides are actually making more sense than they did when they were separate. So
we I've not gotten as clearly as far as you have in this. We fiddled with the idea of thinking about that through feedback, and how feedback would look different in a small group society versus a large group society, and what we can learn from that then to teach us, what to look for, and then also what to change. I mean, we not got very far at the big, but at the micro we're much better at it. Meaning we know that, we start with then saying, well, firm needs to essentially take its signals from its customers, and it needs to be focusing on value from its customers. So it needs to be pulling that as being a more important feedback.
That's interesting. Okay.
Which it wasn't before. It was looking for feedback primarily from its group. And then how that group was looking at business, the firm, as a tool to extract resources so that it can have resources for the group. And what we're trying to do is say, well, actually, that firm should be a vehicle through which the society organizes resources to solve problems. So there are almost two different functions of how you look at a firm over time, right? Which means then the whole feedback of the system would be completely different. Because you're not pulling energy or information from the community about how the firm has to go out in the world and take something from somebody and bring it back to the community, but you're actually thinking about the community looking at this firm, as a resource to deliver services and be good to them and solve problems. You know what I mean? Which changes the nature of what is the more important feedback.
Well, that's interesting.
Which has an energy, has an energy flow component to it, because that winds into and follows finance, right? Which becomes the energy source in some cases.
Exactly, right. Wow, I'm going to have to. This is going to make me think for a while. So I don't have a clear answer off the top of my head, because I haven't been thinking of it in terms of where you get your dominant feedback from. See, I do more on the idea that you have to pay attention to both the internal and the external feedback systems going on. And that a large part of the problem is that what happens with oligarchies is that, okay, so you start small, but there are rules for, in order to get bigger, you have to have all of these, you have to keep small groups connected in this ever growing meshwork of connective tissue. So that's why you have to have infrastructure for communicating, you have to have infrastructure for rewards, and you have to have, so you actually have to have these sort of structural intricacy, is what I call it, instead of complexity, to keep everything in sync and going well. All right. But what happens is you get to a certain size, and the guys at the top are functionally disconnected from the guys every place else. So they become their internal feedbacks is all about their peers, and so they, in oligarchies, they're much more concerned about the moves of their rivals and their peers and their allies than they are about what's happening in the rest of the organization per se. And so that somehow and how you break that fascination or focus on an obsession with the moves of rivals is something I don't know. Because what happens is that because they end up ignoring both the internal of their own organization and the external kind of like environmental kinds of impacts, or just sort of more general, trading going on with neighbors and things like that. So they're ignoring a lot of that while they're focused on making sure that they have enough power to, avoid getting taken over or hijacked or destroyed by their rivals. And so it's the places where they're ignoring that causes the problem, that eventually builds into the place where you come to a choice point. You're either going to collapse, or they call it social suicide. That's what one of the sociologists, Jared Diamond, calls it. He says, societies aren't murdered, they commit social suicide. They slit their wrists and over many decades watch themselves slowly bleed to death. And it's because they're ignoring the internal and the local, the non-threatening local kinds of feedback.
Yeah, exactly. This is kind of where we're trying to get to, is then what would be when we've talked about this, what would be the metrics, the sentinel indicators, the things that we need to be looking for, so we recognize as a society that you're starting to commit suicide and you adapt. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, so we've come up with these top 10 things, and some of them are sort of obvious because they're, you have to be able to make sure that you have reliable inputs and healthy outputs. Because if you run out of oil, or your main fuel source, or if you run out of water, or if whatever your food system collapses, all of those are going to just kill you off. And but people, when they're obsessed with their moves of their rivals, they just don't pay attention to that kind of stuff, which is why we have global climate change today.
Sure, and ability for the society to think past its nose is difficult. You know what I mean? Like past
exactly.
The real cost of climate change doesn't get priced in any kind of valid way.
Right.
I think that's part of the slow moving death he's talking about, probably.
Yeah. So some of me thinks that communication is a big part of the problem too, so that we don't get We don't get decent, accurate information. We don't get it. It's not widely disseminated. We don't have good forms for processing it, and we don't have good ways of communicating arcane but important information to regular people who actually need to know this. I mean, I think masks are a good example of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's interesting. One of the challenges that we run into over and over again, and maybe the conclusion, I don't know if it's right, but it certainly seems where we are, is that humans are fundamentally unable to really distinguish good information from bad information, and that
right. They have a trusted higher authority who tells them what to believe.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you create the institutions that would see the value in setting up a process for quality information, distinguishing quality information? I mean, historically, that was somewhat through a structured or regulatory news agency systems. You know what I mean? They could license only 3 national news networks or whatever, and they put some kind of quasi rules on them for quality of news and public good. You know, as that started to disappear or become useless as a mechanism, you know, you get the foxes and the stuff that then see it's in their interest to just create these echo chambers and then lie because it's in their interest to lie or misinform. But like that is something we've been struggling with. How do you create the mechanisms that then will counterbalance and force or create the quality assurance in the system around evidence or information, so that people are confident or have the kind of social cultural norms that they know that this is a good source, that's a bad source.
Yeah, see, there's such a chicken and egg problem here because
yes, it's super difficult.
I mean, okay, so science is actually the birth of science in the 16th and 17th century. The scientific revolution really was a whole. We're going to get together and we care about the quality of the information, and so they set up the Royal Society and these various things, and people cared. But over time, science itself has gotten into the whole oligarchic payment for things, which skews what they go look for and what they do and how they articulate it. And
yeah, for sure.
So I mean, I don't know. I kind of wonder. I mean, a lot of this is just speculation because I don't have any quick answers. In fact, I basically believe that it's the people like you and me too, but to a lesser extent, who are working on the rubber meets the road that are going to figure this stuff out for a new set of reforms that we can. That's going to. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it's going to move it in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's the right answer, though, that you're not looking for a finite, perfect solution. You're looking for a set of guardrails and warning signs, and you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
That say, look, if you as a society want to stay in this lane and deliver the most value back to your society, these are the parameters you need to be looking at. And once they start to go off the rails, you have to really adjust.
And see, that's what motivates me is that for me, these energy systems sciences are telling you what they're giving you targets for exactly what you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And they fit very well with the kind of stuff that you're talking about. You have to be more constructive than you are extractive. You have to focus on building healthy human networks, not just concentrating wealth. You have to have measures that look at those kinds of things. You have to have you have to have regenerative investment in education and in healthcare and in an infrastructure and in water, clean, all the kind of big common cause connective tissue that you need in order to work together and survive as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, we have like 10 of those, but trying to get people to understand that those are the kinds of metrics you need in order to get. Well, you also have to have a balance of small, medium, and large, and that ends up being a balance of resilience and efficiency. So you can't overemphasize any one of these things. So balance becomes a big deal.
Yeah, the kind of window of viability or
Vitality, yeah.
Vitality, yeah, which is actually quite an exceedingly useful tool, by the way, or idea.
Oh, I'm glad. Yeah.
Yeah, I use it all the time because it is. We've even the frameworks we use are based somewhat on that idea that you have to create these counterbalancing mechanisms within the system so it doesn't get to the extremes. There's always going to
Exactly,
be
right.
pushback somehow.
So it's, you have to have balanced growth and development as well. So
Mhm.
well, okay. So I'm going to stop now, partly because
Yeah.
my hour is about up, and
Good.
because these things are, we're going to be talking about this for a long time, I think.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's very difficult, and some of the relics in these systems are hard to overcome. I think you know what I mean. The oligarchy structures and the norms around them, and G and GDP, or they're kind of relics in my sense. You know what I mean, that have influence but are really not useful anymore.
Right, exactly. Right. I mean, that's my basic theory, is that hierarchies are necessary and oligarchies are now becoming seriously outdated and dangerous to our health, the health of our whole.
For sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, figuring out how to get the society to move past that kind of oligarchy structure, that's essentially still what we're looking at. Is how do you understand that? What does that mean? And then what is the path towards that type of society?
Okay, well, so let's have more of that conversation in the near future.
Yeah, this is excellent.
All right, take care.
Thank you.